Li Bai, at Xie Tiao Tower in Xuanzhou, a farewell feast for Secretary Xu Yun. I've given up on yesterday since it abandoned me. Now I face today's new troubles with a troubled heart. Strong winds bear the autumn wild goose away to far-off places. From this high tower, I can only down my wine and watch. Your vivid writings bring to mind the Jianan style and express too the spirit of Xie Tiao, encompassing the bold and brilliant, urging us to soar to heaven, touch the moon. Slice water with a sword, it still flows on. Drink to drown your sorrow. Sorrow wins. Life in this world can never match our dreams. Tomorrow I'll lose my hair, step in my boat, and sail away. So, this is the last of the heptasyllabic old-style poems by Li Bai present in this collection. And it's a rather brief one. Like other poems that we've encountered in this collection, it's a poem about parting. Li Bai is parting from a friend, Secretary Xu Yun. From what I've read elsewhere, this Secretary Xu Yun is actually called Li Jun. He was a relative of Li Bai. In fact, the Xu Yun in the title of this poem, Xu Yun means something like Uncle Jun. So it's like an informal way of referring to a relative. So this is a poem about parting. Scholar officials parting because Secretary Xu Yun is going to the capital to serve in the Imperial Secretariat, I believe, as an imperial proofreader. He's going to serve in office while Li Bai remains in this area. This poem was written in the Xie Tiao Tower in Xuanzhou. Xuanzhou was in Anhui, in the central eastern part of China, close to the ending of the Yangtze River Valley, which is where Li Bai spent his last years after he had lost imperial favor, and he was in a sort of internal exile, as you will. Xuanzhou was a relatively important town in that area, and in a previous era, it had been a city governed by one of the great poets of the period of disunion, Xie Tiao, who ordered the tower in which the setting for this poem takes place to be built. Xie Tiao, he was a relative of another Xie that we've already encountered, Xie Lingyun. And like his relative, he encountered a relatively early and unpleasant death in the world of conspiracies and murder of the period of disunion. He was executed on trumped-up charges when he was 35 years old. He wrote poetry in the style of his relative, that is, landscape poetry of mountains and forests. Also some poems about the tensions between his desire for retirement and his urge to serve in office. And these other poems are probably the ones that are influencing some of the things that Li Bai says in this poem, in which he is homaging the style of this antecessor who talked about retiring from office. In this poem, Xie Tiao is referred to also as Little Xie in comparison to the Big Xie, which is Xie Lingyun. So the two topics of this poem, the two main topics, parting and also there is the enjoying company of another scholar in a tower, in an important monument. Minor topics, retirement, the virtues of retirement or of serving in office, and a very oblique complaint, we could say, of Li Bai at not being himself recognized and employed. And there are also references to writing styles of the past, of Xie Tiao, but of others as well, in the praise that is given to Secretary Xu Yun. Okay, let's as usual, start by taking a look at the poem. The poem in the translation that I have by Michael Farman is divided into 4 stanzas, and they go like this. First one. I've given up on yesterday since it abandoned me. Now I face today's new troubles with a troubled heart. So this is a curious opening. In the original, this first couplet is not heptasyllabic. It's 11 syllables long, each of the lines. So it's a very majestic, very long, very big opening, which, as you can see, establishes a big contrast between the past and the present. But what joins both the past and the present is the lack of happiness, the lack of joy in Li Bai's poetic persona. So the past, yesterday, has been given up. The past has abandoned Li Bai. It hasn't been kind to him. And, we know from his biography that the past, which is already past anyway, that past wasn't, he had his moments of slight imperial patronage, other patronage, but basically he had not been successful in being recognized and appreciated by the emperor or by the ruling elite. So he has been abandoned by the past. No trust, no nostalgia can be felt for it. But the present isn't that much better either. Now I face today's new troubles with a troubled heart. The new sun brings many troubles and sorrows. So there is no cease to sorrow for the poet. And part of the sorrow, at least in the context of this poem, is the parting of Secretary Xu Jun. So that would be the typical feeling, even stereotypical feeling of a poem on parting. But we might read between the lines that the sorrows of the present, that the troubled heart of Li Bai is also related to the lack of recognition in the present for his worth and merit, and the fact that he is not being called back to the capital to serve and to be honored. So after this majestic line, the next couplets will be heptasyllabic. Second stanza. Strong winds bear the autumn wild goose away to far-off places. From this high tower, I can only down my wine and watch. So if the first stanza introduced what was a very abstract one, a very generic one, basically introducing the sadness and the unhappiness and the frustrations of Li Bai with past and present, the second stanza acts more as the specific introduction to this poem and locates us in its physical and chronological space. It's autumn, and we are in a high tower drinking wine. It's the farewell party for Secretary Xu Yun. The wild goose is a symbol of traveling, of migration, of autumn. So this must be taking place in autumn, of exiled or wandering or traveling scholar officials or lovers, the loved one parting. So we might imagine that this strong wind that is bearing the autumn wild goose to faraway places, it might be something that can be seen at the time of the party. Maybe Li Bai does look out of one of the windows of the tower and see some flying geese, but it's probably a metaphor for Secretary Xu Jun. He is the wild goose who is flying off to the capital to serve. Meanwhile, a frustrated Li Bai can only lament his friend's parting and lament his staying. So he just drinks wine and broods, watching. Next stanza. So the third stanza is a stanza that basically praises the scholar that is leaving, probably a slightly hyperbolic praise, probably a bit too generous, but it is only to be expected from this sort of poetry, to include a little bit of flattery to the other scholar official who is being homaged by the poem. Your vivid writings bring to mind the Jianan style and express, too, the spirit of Xie Tiao, encompassing the bold and brilliant, urging us to soar to heaven, touch the moon. So the poet is basically saying here, you're a great writer, It's good that you have been chosen to serve in the capital. You have a lofty spirit, a bold and brilliant spirit. You push people to, you push their imagination and their expectations to the highest realms, even as far as to touch the moon and to fly through heaven. A few references that are interesting here that might need explanation. The Jianan style mainly. So the Jianan era was a period at the end of the Han Dynasty, basically the beginning of the 3rd century of our era, which saw the flourishing of the old style poetry. You know, the old style poetry really started to become an important literary genre and to produce great poets and great individualistic authors in the Jianan period. Some of the greatest Chinese poets are from this period. So, for example, Cao Cao, who was a ruler and a poet, or his son Cao Pi, who was also an emperor and a writer of essays. Cao Shi, another son of Cao Cao, who is arguably among the top 5 best Chinese poets of all time, and who basically defined the form of the pentasyllabic Shi in the old style. A few others, Wang Zan, who made poems about the fall of the capitals during the wars at the end of the Han. It was a time for very good writing, a writing that was appreciated especially for its directness, its vividness, its relative plainness, and its sincerity, and the way in which it represented the grim realities of war and chaos at the end of a dynasty. So the praises that are lavished on Xu Yun are, you follow the Jianan style. You remember me, that style of sincerity, of outspokenness, and of manliness. But also the spirit of Xie Tiao. Xie Tiao came from much later than the Jianan period. He lived, he was executed around the year 500 of our era. So that would be 300 years after the Jianan era and 250 years before Li Bai, approximately. Xie Tiao represents the ornamented, slightly decadentist, fin de siècle style of poetry of the period of disunion, which was very baroque, very decorative, very interested in the aesthetic more than in the moral. But Secretary Xu Yun seems to be able to merge both things, the Jianan style and the spirit of Xie Tiao. Xie Tiao was valued a lot by the Tang poets as a poet of genius, of originality, of creativity. And here we have the union of two things that are generally contrasted in poetry, which is directness and solidity of content, and bedazzlement and beautifulness and well-crafted language and imagery. So the more formal aspects and the more conceptual aspects merged into one. Very interesting. In the original poem, one of the lines which has not been translated in this stanza by this translator includes something like Penglai, his workplace, a building of literature and scholars. There is a reference to the place where Secretary Xu Yun is going. He was going to work in the secretariat in the imperial palace. And since the Han Dynasty, the building where the archives of the secretariat were held was called the Penglai Pavilion, Penglai being one of the islands of the Immortals. So there's a reference of this in the original poem, which is not in this translation. Some translators also seem to make a caesura with the references that we've just mentioned to the Jianan style in Xie Tiao. So in some translators, it is considered that the reference to the Jianan style is saved for Xu Yun, but the reference to the spirit of Xie Tiao is mentioned by Li Bai as a property of his own poetry. So that would be interesting as well, like Li Bai possibly saying, you have this directness of the Jianan era style, which is good and probably good for the functions you will have to do. I have the verbal pyrotechnics and the artistic genius of Xie Tiao, and well, that's what I do. So each of us, to each his own, sum cuique, as the Latins used to say. Okay, finally, the last stanza. So after praising the relative, now we get the conclusion, and we get back to Li Bai, if we hadn't got back already in the previous stanza. Slice water with a sword, it still flows on. Drink to drown your sorrow. Sorrow wins. Life in this world can never match our dreams. Tomorrow I'll lose my hair, step in my boat, and sail away. In this context of sadness, in which his friend relative is going away, in which Levi remains alone and unrecognized in the eastern coast of China, he tries to find something to compensate for the sadness and the pain. But it's not possible. And, slicing water with a sword is pointless. You cannot cut the water, it keeps flowing. Drinking to drown your sorrow. It's useless, it floats up in the end. Yeah, you can't drown your sorrows in wine. You can't make them disappear. So both images are very similar. They're a very good parallelistic couplet. The first one sounds like an idiom or a more common, a more abstract phrase. The second is the specific thing that Levi is trying to do to forget his sorrow. Both are pointless. So what's the conclusion? A very Taoistic one. Whether Levi really felt it or believed it is another issue, but the conclusion is the square, standard Taoistic renunciation of the futile pursuits of the world. So life can never match our dreams. However much we might dream or we might hope for success in the world, life will never match up to the dream. So what is Levi going to do? He's going to lose his hair, soltarse la melena. And this is a reference that perhaps needs to be explained. Chinese scholar officials, when serving in office, had to have their hair tied in a specific way, in a band under the hats of office that they wore. So, taking out the hairpins and letting the hair loose very clearly points to renouncing the possibility or the interest in serving in office. So I'll lose my hair, step in a boat, and sail away. So again, a lot of Taoist texts and poems include the image of the fisherman or of the wise retired one who follows the Tao, floating away in a fishing boat and renouncing the world for the quiet and peaceful life. So Levi seems to be concluding the poem by saying, okay, I renounce everything. I'll just keep on living and probably try to search for the real world of transcendence, the world of dreams, which is not matched by this miserable and petty world of realities. So, quite a nice poem, very representative also of Levi's Taoistic inclinations and of his self-appreciation, which was based on his very real genius and value, but it was still quite big.